All right, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Manager, is back for video number 6 in this wonderful and exciting series of Vue.js authentication with Auth0. And I'm going to use the Vuex global component and Vue routing component, the router setup, to make it all happen. And that's outside of what Auth0 does in their setup, and I'm going to get to that. That's pretty much what this video is going to be about. First, I want to do a recap. We're on video number 6. The first video, we did an overview of what the project was going to be. Second one, I did an outline trying to show all the various steps. The third and the fourth were setup install for the base project and getting us up and running with a project that we can program, a Vue project with Vuetify. And then down here in 5, we added some pages. Ultimately, we're going to protect a certain portion of the website or application such that some pages are open to the public and some pages will be forced to go through a login process before the content is able to be seen. So with that said, let's talk about where we're at in the structure. This is the from video 2. This is the steps that I was hoping to take in the project. So the last thing we did was right here, and now we're finally into the implementing Auth0. But I'm going to take a little side step, and before I actually implement it, I'm going to talk about Auth0, and I'm going to talk about how their instructions for implementation differ from what I'm going to do, and why I think it's important. So let's get into that. That's going to be my second slide here. And so Auth0 has an installation guide, and if you go to their website, you click on, you hover developers here, you look at the get started, and if you want to create a single page app, which is what Vue mostly is in the typical configuration, and so it says what technology are you using. We're using Vue, and so we get through to a tutorial that demonstrates how to add user login. So this is everything I'm doing, but I'm going to do it a little different. So they say it takes about 15 minutes. It does if you don't understand what you're doing and just throw things in there, but then things don't work quite as well or as easily as you might want them to. So that's why I'm trying to give a bigger overview and talk about how how I'm going to do things. So the first thing we got to talk about, well, let's kind of go through their setup. So we'll get into the depths of how to, all this stuff that it's talking about. And this is talking about configuring Auth0. So this is logging into the Auth0 management interface. And you got to set some stuff up there for your app to communicate with Auth0. And so there's keys. If you've ever dealt with anything third party, there's always keys nowadays or tokens. So you set some of that stuff up. You set up some URLs. We'll talk about all this stuff later. You need to get their code into your application. We'll talk about that, or you can do it this way. I suggest you don't do it that way. That this is potential security hacks going on here that I'll talk about at some point. The universal login, we'll get into that. That's how you're sending them over to. You're going to send your user over to the Auth0 website, and then they'll come back. I kind of talked about that in another video. We'll get to that in depth again probably. And then we get down to finally the code, where this right here, this is Vue code. Well, no, this is JavaScript code. And this is code that they want you to put in your application, in your Vue application. So they call it they call it a service, an authentication service they want you to create. And basically that's just a JavaScript file that's a class which you instantiate into an object, and then you can communicate with that object. And then that object will communicate back and forth and do the login and log out stuff for you. So let's kind of talk about that now. So this is their service that they have you create, and like I said again, it's just a JavaScript file that you stick in your project, and then you'll call it from your project. We'll talk about that in a second. But ultimately, you import, this is their code that you import into a variable, and then that variable allows you to communicate with their code and easily handle doing all the token exchange and all the authentication stuff that you don't want to have to think about. And that's basically just this login here. So instead of doing a bunch of communications with tokens and saving stuff, you just call this .authorize, Auth0, which is that object, that you constructed from their code. So you call their code and say, hey, do the authorization process for me. And to set that up, we had to instantiate. I guess this Auth0 is not the one up here. It's this Auth0. So you import their code into the Auth0. That becomes this. And then you use a new to create an object out of it, and then you give it some parameters to send into the constructor function. Now you've got that auth object. So then you call that auth object locally. So this guy is this guy with the this. It connects it because of the this, and you call authorize. And so then it does the work to do that authorization for you using your credentials. So what that's going to do is send them over to their universal login. I talked about that in another video, and I'll get into that again. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is how they use that service in the application. So we've got this class that we set up, and once it's constructed, once this auth service is constructed in our app, then we'll be able to call the login function through that. And then this is just a partial bit of it. They redo it down here. This is the same thing. See, it's the AuthService.js file, and then they add more functionality. That's what I think this .. / refers to the two functions that are missing above, but they have more functionality: handle authentication, set session, and obviously log out, and a way to check and see if the user is authenticated from your application. So that's their service thing that you're going to put into your app. I am going to switch to Auth0. It's the same page. I'm going to switch to the same page on a different tab so that I can switch between the two. But if we scroll down far enough, we see this provided login control. And so this is in your app.view. And if you recall, let me pull it up here. This is the code that we've been working in, and we've got a file called app.view. And that's our main app where we put our, our toolbar and our routing pages to our router in our Vue router component. And this is where the pages get loaded when we run the application. So that's where they're saying to put this. They're doing it a little differently as far as styling. They're not using Vuetify, fine, no problem. They're using, I think, Twitter's Bootstrap framework, and so they're creating a navigation here with a simple home button, and then a login and a log out button in the navigation. That's the end of the navigation there. And then they have their router view down at the bottom. And so you can see that they have the same router view as I have, but they're passing these things called props. And that's just a way of passing variables down to the child components. And we'll get back to that in a second. But in that same file, you see they have you import the auth service. So all this code that we looked at before, the auth service JS that they have you basically copy and paste into your application, it ends up in a variable in your component, your top level component, your app.view component. And then what they do is they take that auth service and they create a new object from it, because you're exporting a class here, right? We're exporting a class called auth service. Then we're calling in that class, giving it a variable, and saying, hey, do an instantiation on that class and create a new object for me to communicate with. That connects you using all the parameters, all the login config parameters. Now this thing connects us to our backend Auth0 interface. And what they do is they take that, they break out. This is called deconstruction. And so this auth object, they pull out the login function, the logout function, the authenticated variable, and the auth notifier variable. Here's the authenticated auth notifier. These are things that are just directly accessed. And then we said the login was missing because of these ... and the logout here. So basically, we're just accessing this object by variables. it would be no different for them to just, instead of using, this here, you could just say auth.login to get the login. They're just trying to make it easier by separating it out. And then, so what they do is they bring in that auth service, they instantiate it into a new object, and then that's it. They never use that service again anywhere else, and you really can't because you're creating an object here, and so it gets confused if you try and use it again elsewhere, at least as far as my capabilities. I struggled with it. What they want you to do is they want you to pass this auth variable that has your login, logout capabilities down into your components below. So if we look at a component system, I'm looking at a Vue.js here, and this is how Vue organizes its components. So this component here is our app.Vue.js, or our app.Vue file. That is, again, this main file here, app.Vue, which has our exterior, our main template. And then this router.view would be a subcomponent, and we could put this toolbar into another subcomponent that we call with just a couple tags, as opposed to having all this information. So if this is our main template, then you can see this box here represents their navigation. This box here represents this gray area, which then has two components within it, which is what these two are. And this component here, this gray area, is this component, which has three components in it. And so that's how you build out a Vue project. Is everything's a component, and then everything gets fed up, or actually fed down to. So in our case, we pretty much just have this outer framework, which would be this whole thing is a gray area, and then our routing component, which would probably be just this gray area with one box inside of it that shows the routed 2 pages. But you can see that applications get more complex than that. And so the way they're doing it, if we go back to their code, they are taking that auth variable, and in their data section, this is where you set up your local variables. They tie it to an auth variable. Now this auth comma is the same as auth:auth, which is ES6 functionality, and it says that take that defined auth variable, which is this guy, and assign it to a local auth within the scope of the templates and the project, which would be accessed by this.auth. I know it's a bit confusing. And the same thing with the authenticated. They're taking this authenticated and tying it locally to the application locally. And so now we take these guys and they use them in their app.view. Remember, this is the source app.view. And they pass those variables down in what's called props to the next component. So if this is our router view and we go back to the diagram, this is the top component that's passing those props, and it's passing them down to this component. And so those two variables are available now in this component as props. Now if I wanted to send them into anything else, I would have to send them into their components respectively. And if I needed the component down here, I would have to, if I needed those variables down here, I would have to pass those variables through each component, which means I'm just, constantly writing extra code to pass this through. And I don't like to do that. That's what I love about Vuex, is Vuex just lets us put those variables in a global variable out here, and then all these guys can access that global variable as needed, and we don't have to pass down the props all the way through. So it makes life easier, and so that's what we're going to do. So they create this auth service that only gets used once and then gets passed down as variables to where it's needed. For me, that's confusing and takes a lot of extra effort, always having to wire things up. If I'm in this component and I want to do a logout function, I got to make sure I'm wired all the way through here. And that's just a frustration that I don't want to have to deal with, especially when it comes to debugging. The next thing is they use this foreign emit function. And Vue has its own native emit function. So if we go back to their code and we look at their their service handler again, the code that they set up for you to use as a service handler. And we look at it, they bring in this event emitter, and they tell you you have to npm install an event emitter. So this is more code, more bloat for your application that's unnecessary. It might be small files, I haven't looked into it, but it's unnecessary because, number one, in our project, we're going to use the global system. We're not even going to use event emitters, but if you wanted to use an event emitter, Vue has its own event system. If you look at the VueJS guides here and you just Google search for VueJS emit, you'll get this page, and it's the custom events page, and you can see that natively you can do emit events, which is allowing you to take something from down here and bubble it back up to this component so that it can be reactively changed to all the rest of the components. So if the logout happened out here and you needed to change that is authorized variable to tell all these other components that suddenly now the person's logged out and you need to hide any information, well, you have to emit that information back up, and then this guy changes the root variable, which then gets passed down to everything else reactively, and they get changed reactively. So again, that's just too much for me. I prefer the Vuex having a global system out here. It's not pictured, but if we picture another box out here with a bunch of variables that all these guys can access, and that when it's updated, changes all these other guys, it tells these other guys to update instantaneously, reactively, it's just easier for me. You don't have to do all that wiring and passing of variables. So each one of these guys, if they had content that needed to be logged in to see, you have to pass that is logged in variable or that authenticated variable down through every single thing. And so it's just frustrating. So I don't understand why they pull in that foreign event emitter when Vue already has that installed. But again, we don't even need that because we're going to use Vuex, and that gets down to this, that they don't leverage Vuex, and we are going to leverage Vuex. The next thing, they do something weird here. I don't really get this. They throw some functionality into the Vue data function. So if we look here, this is just kind of bad practice. I got to find it again here. So typically, when we have a data object, we simply return, or a data function for our templates, we simply return an object. And you can read about why you need to use a function to return an object. It's so that two components don't get confused. That's a whole nother thing. But normally you don't see a function in the data object. If we look at our code, let's take a look at our app.vue. This is what data normally looks like. Granted, we don't have any data to return, but there's no function up here above it. And if you look at most Vue code, I don't think you'll ever see a function up there. And what they're not leveraging here is the fact that Vue has a lifecycle diagram. And so when any component or even the initial Vue application is instantiated, the component goes through a life cycle here. And there's all kinds of events that happen before the component gets mounted and displayed to the user. So that router.view, this component here, this is a component that goes through that life cycle. Also, the outer component, the outer project is a component in itself. Not project, the outer template is a component in itself that goes through that process. But anyway, so if our router goes through this process, or our app.vue, which is where this is located, this is, again, if I scroll back up, that's in the app.vue template, which goes through that process. The data function gets called because they need to get the variables. Vue needs to get the variables. So this function gets called. But really, if we were to stay true to Vue, we'd want to put it in one of these red hooks here that we have available from Vue. So we'd want to put that function call in a before create, a created, a before mount, or a mounted function. And that's just a matter of taking that function. If we've got a data function here, we can put a before create function here, and it might be an object that's got functions, but anyway, regardless, it's something to the effect of this, where you add it here, and then you would put that code that they have here in this before create thing, rather than up awkwardly in your data object. So they're just kind of using a backdoor. I don't like that. And I just wanted to point that out. I'm not going to do that. I just think that's poor coding practice. Maybe I'm not understanding something. They might be much better coders than me and just be understanding something that I don't understand. Or they're just trying to make it simple so that it works in every case everywhere. I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to drop that anyway, because that stuff's all going to go in our Vuex global system anyway. And then finally, I kind of talked about this before. Authentication takes place at the component level. So really, this is your main template, and then this is your router page. Let's say this is your router page, and then it's got some components within it. Each time your router is changed, each one of your views that gets loaded into the router at the time has to understand the authorization, and if it's not available, it's going to react or redirect to a login page. So each one of your pages has to handle that redirect, and so it gets confusing as to, did I put a redirect in this one? Did I protect this one properly? You're way down in it, and you get lost when you're in the files, because you have to put it in every single file. So I'm going to move it up. There's actually a box that comes in up here before the component, and it's actually before this view cycle. Before your component goes through its life cycle, the routing function, if I was to draw a box up here, the routing function is called first. So we are going to talk about the Vue Router and how it allows us to, before each here, we can act on our routing service and do some work on the routes and decide if the page is able to be seen or not. And you can see there's some auth logged in stuff going on here in just the Vue Router example. We'll take a look at this stuff and say, hey, is that page available to the public? Okay, sure, sure, let it go on. If not, redirect them to the login. So now we've got all our redirection magic, or all our logic, in one place, and also maybe a second place if we look at the router. Remember, we talked about this here. Whoops, I redid this video before. That's left over from the last time. Here is our router.js file. If you remember in the last video, we created these routes, which is a path for each page as we load it. So if we load the home page, remember I have this is a home page. That's what got loaded there. Actually, let me pull up the dev environment and show that. All right, so I built the dev environment, so it's running now. So when I click here, these guys point to routes, and so when I click about, I load down here this page. So if we go back to the hierarchy here, this would be my app.view that has my container, and then this would be the view that gets changed. So this area would be getting changed, and if we pretend there's only one here instead of two, this would be our routing component that updates, and that's where we're seeing the change. So that's where we're seeing this change when that changes. Notice this part up here, this is not part of the routing component. This is our navigation that's above. It's not changing. It's not being reloaded or anything's happening to this necessarily. Just this bottom part is changing. So back in here, that's what these paths, they're each pointing to load those different components in that router area. And so in here, we're going to put a little meta object, and we're going to say, whether or not it's a protected or a public page. And this isn't the right syntax, but I just want to show you where it's going to go. So we'll be able to look, at all our routes. We'll be able to look at all our different routes all in one place and see which ones are protected and which ones aren't. So that's my goal with putting the protection logic in a single place, two places really, but all together, clumped together. It's going to be here in the router that defines our routes, because our routes are going to define what's protected and what's not protected. And then in the before each, where was that? In the before each functionality, that we're actually going to take this code right here, and we're ultimately going to tag it onto the end of this file because it's part of our routing. So I guess it's going to be in one file. So we'll be able to have our logic here, and then be able to see which ones are protected and which ones aren't, all in one place. And so we won't have to dig into different files to see what's happening. And plus, this will take place right away, so a view won't load before it gets redirected to something else. It'll take place before the view is loaded. So let's go back to the let's go back to the where we are here. So that takes us through, and finally, it doesn't leverage Vuex. I kind of talked about that up here. So we're going to leverage Vuex, and we're going to do our authentication verification. That should actually be authentication verification. It takes place at the component level. We're going to do it at the router level. So that's hopefully a somewhat understandable high-level overview. If you didn't understand any of that, you'll hopefully understand it as I go through each of the pieces. I'm going to go in depth much more in each of the pieces. This was just more of a high-level overview to say, hey, yes, I'm going to do something different than what they're doing. I'm not going to implement it their way because I don't think their way is the best way for an overall application, for a larger application. I think there's a better way to do it, and so that's what I'm going to show. So there you have it. So let's close this video out. It's been longer than I wanted it to be, but hopefully it was, again, worthwhile for your time. This has been Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers. Here's our YouTube page here. Trying to grow that subscriber count. I keep talking about how I want to get up to 100 and throw a party, which I've said before is just me going woohoo. And so you heard that already, and that's, takes away your ambition to click this button. But maybe if you want to be nice, you click that button there, and then we see this thing hit 100 soon. Would love to see it hit 1,000 someday. Again, I'm just getting started out here. I've told my clients for years that this is what they need to do, and now I'm starting to do it for myself and our company, and trying to grow our base and our authoritative position on the interwebs. So, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers. This is the website. Load us up at dedicatedmanagers.com. Whatever you need, we can do for you. If you need any professional help, give us a call. We'd be glad to help you with a small part of your program. We'd be glad to take over your project. We can do all kinds of stuff, more than Vue. Give us a shout if you need any help. Click that contact button, throw some information in the form, or call us at the 800 number. Again, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers. Thanks for playing along. See you in the next video.